Welcome again, Luke de Noronha, lecturer at the Sarah Parker Remond Centre at UCL. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So we want to talk about connections between racism and immigration, and it seems to me that your book, Deporting Black Britons, is a really useful place to start to have these conversations. I wondered if you could tell me about the history of Jamaican migration to the UK and how that connects with British imperial history. And I do recognise that's a bit of a big question, but if you could just sort of talk us through the headlines of it.
Yeah, it's a big question. I suppose, of course, Jamaica is and was the UK's most profitable West Indian slave colony in the 18th century and some of the 19th century. So there's the connection originally. England, not Britain, colonized Jamaica and took over from the Spanish in 1655. So there's a long relationship there. And I think it's something like a quarter of enslaved Africans who were brought to the Americas in general by the British came through or via Jamaica. So there's a long connection in that way, which of course is also a story of migration. And then the story of Jamaican migration after emancipation was one of various forms of movement. Britain actually, movement to Britain was in quite small numbers until what we call the Windrush generation, but Jamaicans had been leaving former plantations, moving to cities, moving to Panama to help build the canal, moving to North America on various guest worker programs throughout the 20th century, and then moving to the UK and mainly England from sort of 48 onwards in big numbers. And that's, we mark that with the arrival of the SS Empire Windrush, but people arrived in great numbers after the war to work in various jobs, especially in the NHS and public transport. And then really what the story of post-war controls on immigration is one in which Jamaicans were slowly excluded from their ability to move. Before 62 and until after then, this was not really international migration, it was movement of people within the British Empire. So it was internal migration really, even though it was over long distances. And as rights were removed from people from the colonies and from the Commonwealth from 62 onwards, Jamaicans began to move actually more to the US for a while, but kept moving to the UK, although with lesser rights. And so we have the Windrush generation and many people moving and families joining, but less people moving from the 70s to the 90s. And then there seems to be a lot more people move from Jamaica to the UK from the 90s onwards. And then there's a lot of questions about when visas were introduced and how that changed people's movement. But one thing I suppose is that there's no neat kind of trajectory of when people stop moving and start. People move in different ways, but their status changes. And that's one of the things that I found in my work, especially was not only the ways in which there's kind of mass migration, but there's family connections being rebuilt, but always negotiating complex laws and rules, which make it harder for people to do that.
So in your book, you talk about Britain being multi-status. Can you tell us what exactly you mean by multi-status and how that helps us understand the relation between racism and immigration controls?
Yeah, maybe it's best to give a kind of example. So one of the people who features prominently in the book is called Chris. He moved to the UK when he was 13 or 14 and lived in West London. His mother had been here for a few years. So she arrived on a work visa and then a student visa, and then was trying to regularize her stay. Chris came as a visitor. So he was supposed to only be there for 6 months, but he stayed and started going to school. So at that point, he was a visitor or an overstayer. His mum fixed her stay up and got indefinite leave to remain and Chris was added to that application, partly because she'd had 2 children in Britain with a British father who were therefore British citizens. And then at some point, Chris had committed an offence and a couple of years later, his mother and her daughter, who was born in Jamaica, and 2 sons who were born in England, became citizens. They naturalised, while Chris wasn't able to because he had a criminal record. but he had a child with a British citizen, so he had a British child, and he had friends who were, so we think about the people he was hanging around with or working with, friends who had different statuses. Some were recent arrivals from Jamaica and didn't have any status or had temporary status. Others, Chris at one point might have applied for asylum, for example. And so I suppose Multistatus is trying to get at the fact that there are more people in the UK in Chris's kind of situation and in the situation of his family and friends, which is that there are many people who aren't citizens, it's harder for them to then get citizenship because there's been restrictions placed on the ability to naturalise. And more broadly across lots of countries, migrants have been made more temporary. And the idea that you move and then you'll get your status and then you'll become a citizen seems to have been taken unfastened. And so the idea is that there's lots of people who don't have full citizenship, but they have different kinds of statuses which change over time in complicated ways. And the people they hang around with or live their lives with, their statuses will vary over time as well. So rather than imagining that you have kind of immigrants over here and citizens over there, which of course many of us know isn't true because of our colleagues and friends and family members, partners, we complicate that by thinking about status multiplying in complicated ways. And also, I mean, the importance of that for thinking about race and racism is that, you know, racism as it affects people with different statuses, you know, works differently, because for one person without status, it will mean a very different set of things. Like it might mean, you know, not being able to work, not being able to access housing. It might mean welfare system. It might mean being thrown into a detention centre and facing deportation. And so Multistatus is trying to get that, it's trying to basically put status and immigration control into the conversation, into the heart of the conversation that we have about racial justice, because if we leave out, and one, we're not kind of talking about up to 3 million people or 5 million people who aren't British citizens. And two, it means that we don't think about how those things interact, immigration control with racism, and how that affects different people, individuals, friends and families.
So can you tell me about the UK's hostile environment? I mean, and I'm thinking specifically that, you know, it's aimed at undocumented migrants, and yet it seems that so many others get caught up in it. Yeah,
so the hostile environment, you know, Theresa May literally said she wanted to create, when she was Home Secretary, a really hostile environment for illegal immigrants. That was her language. And this is a time of, you know, David Cameron and Theresa May joining in immigration raids and sending vans around London boroughs saying, go home or face arrest. So a really spectacular kind of moment of proving that we're tough on immigration. And what the hostile environment did, which came in fully with the Immigration Act in 2014 and then 2016, was to kind of turn everyone into a border guard, to make the border, to internalize the border, you might say, but to mean that, and the attempt was to root out so-called illegal immigrants by denying them access to basic public services and to the means of life. It's not necessarily, I don't think the Home Office ever thought that it would necessarily work, but it certainly seems tough. If someone who has no rights to access services can't get welfare benefits, can't access any housing benefits, will be forced into homelessness, can't open a bank account, can't get a driving license. These are the things, can't go to university. Maybe even their kids can't go to school because we'll do nationality checks. We'll enforce landlords and doctors and teachers and lecturers and you know, bank officials to check everyone's immigration status. Then we'll somehow find the illegal immigrants, and then we'll locate them, and then we can enforce action against them, or they'll be forced to go home. And that was kind of the idea, that people will voluntarily self-deport themselves because they can't survive. I mean, that was pretty much the explicit policy, even though they might euphemize some of that, some of that intent. But of course, the net was cast much wider, because how do you tell an illegal immigrant from a legal immigrant, or a legal immigrant from a citizen in a multicultural country like Britain? You know, that the landlords were not forced to do, they were forced to ensure that they weren't renting to anyone who didn't have rights to. So they had to check people, but often it meant that they didn't bother checking white British people because they didn't really need to, but they would check black and brown British citizens who were then discriminated against in the housing market and in various other institutions. But really, yeah, it became, the hostile environment was an attempt to locate so-called illegal immigrants. And of course, it's a very difficult thing to do, and status is very confusing, and landlords and university lecturers don't understand immigration law, neither do immigration lawyers half the time. So, so yeah, it ended up creating quite a hostile environment for many of us. And now we're all sort of trained in checking and being checked, and we don't think it's unusual in a country that used to pride itself apparently on not having a national ID, on, you know, having to give your passport in when you get a new job or rent a house, because apparently we have the wonderful right to rent and the right to work. So yeah, that's what the hostile environment's done. But it was also, the only small add-on is, it was also an attempt to create better information for the Home Office, which didn't have very good databases and had always struggled with the administration and bureaucracy. But if it could sort of get access to NHS England and Schools England and the DVLA and the bank's information, then it would have up-to-date addresses, etc. So it would be easier to enforce action. And so this databases, effectively, it was an attempt to create a better system of databases on immigrants and ultimately on all of us, because if you need to know who illegal immigrants are, then you need to know who we are too.
So I think one of the great strengths of your book is the richness of your ethnographic data, and the fact that you worked very closely with the people in the book and also their family and friends. So I wonder, how do the people that you worked with understand the relation between being Black and their vulnerability to deportation?
Yeah, this was maybe one of the bits that I found hardest to make sense of in the book and in my conversations with people, because it's not an easy question. You know, being Black for these people who were deported sort of has everything to do with it. They're being deported, but also it's not the main factor. The main factor is their passport. And when I was having conversations with people, they sort of struggled to make sense of this. So some individuals would say, it's not about being Black, it's actually about the fact that I've not got a British passport, because my Black friends who are British, they're not in this situation. They might have spent a couple of years in prison, but then they'll never have to be they'll never be illegal, they'll never be considered an alien, they'll never be put on a deportation flight. This is what some people said. And then others said, you know, the police were hassling me and my friends because we were Black. Racism, I experienced racism in the youth prison system, and, you know, from police every time I left my house. And so there was this feeling of kind of being surveyed whenever you were anywhere, that made it impossible to live any kind of life. And that wasn't about being, you know, legally foreign, that was about being racialized as Black. And so both of these things are true, and we have to somehow kind of integrate them into an analysis of multi-status Britain, or of, you know, racism in Britain, which is that the racism, you know, the structures of racism and racist discrimination in various institutions are the very things that decide who gets their immigration status turned into a deportation flag, because not everyone will, and the vast majority won't. And so if you have a racist criminal justice system and heavily policed neighborhoods, then the people who are subject to that policing are the most likely to find themselves on the charter flights to Jamaica or Nigeria or Ghana, but also to Albania and Pakistan. And so we need to make sense of that, while also listening to people when they say, well, yeah, but there's something about my nationality, there's something about my status, there's something about me not getting myself fixed up early, there's something about the fact that my dad didn't put me on his application. So there's all this stuff that's really legal and really about migration, which interacts with, in my work, racist policing. And that's some of the challenge that we need to, you know, there's no shortcuts, I don't think, to saying, oh, this is all one thing or the other. And one of the things I've reflected on is, you know, how is the deportation of someone like Ricardo, who was over-policed, how does that make him similar in his experiences to Black British people who experience heavy policing, but also different to them because he now lives in Jamaica? How does the fact that, you know, he's been deported then make him similar to the many Romanian or Albanian or Pakistani people who've been deported under the very same laws and with very similar life stories? You know, it doesn't fall neatly into racial categories. It cuts across and is complicated by some of these things. So yeah, I still struggle with trying to make sense of it all, but I think that's precisely the point when you look at some of these life stories.
Thanks very much, Luke. I'm sure you've encouraged people to get out and read your book. I certainly would recommend it. So thanks very much for coming along.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.